All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Environmental Justice. This week, we are going to dive into qualitative research. Okay, so before all of you run away from this video right away, let me explain to you what we're going to talk about, right? So last week, we really went into the high level, theoretical, historical, foundational aspects of environmental justice, right? As a topic, as an organizing movement. But now we're really going to think about how we can apply it as a research method. And we're going to start with qualitative data analysis. So, in these three videos this week, I'm going to walk you through how to essentially conduct an entire qualitative analysis, right? I'm going to go through these step by step in three different video sections. These videos are going to be a little bit longer, a little bit more dense. But it's really good information, right? There is a good chance some of you are going to be conducting a qualitative analysis in the future. And you might want to come back to this video because I never had anybody explain it to me like this, and I wish I had. So let's see how it goes. Again, I'm always open to your feedback and to hear how you're engaging with the content. So again, welcome back. Last week we explored the philosophical foundations of justice. We traced theories from Plato to Rawls to Schlossberg. And we went with our friends and unpacked our friends the five dimensions, right? But here's the key question, right? How do we move from theory to actual research, right? This week, we're going to make a crucial shift. We are moving from asking, what should justice look like, to asking, how does justice actually work in the real world, in a research context, in a practical context, right? So think about it this way. When Rawls described his theory of justice, he was prescribing, telling us what an ideal society should look like. When you interview farmers, per se, about wildlife conflicts or fisher people about marine habitat destruction, you're describing, documenting what people actually experience. Both approaches matter, okay? But they require completely different tools. So today, we're going to look at how we can transform those five theoretical justice dimensions into actual research instruments, right? And we're going to learn how to use them to analyze real data. By the end of today's lecture, I want you to know how to take our friends distributive, procedural, recognitional, structural, ecological, and turn them into coding categories that you can use to analyze interviews, policy documents, case studies, a whole host of different data sources, right? So, why qualitative coding? Remember when we talked about different approaches, quantitative, qualitative last week? Qualitative was one of the approaches that I highlighted, right? Why is it so powerful for justice research? Well, justice isn't just about numbers, right? It's not just income statistics or meeting attendance rates. Justice is about how people experience and interpret fairness in their daily lives. Here's an example, right? Imagine a farmer receives government compensation for crop damage from elephants. I love to go back to these examples from my actual research, right? And on paper, the numbers look good. Distributional justice is achieved, right? Check that box. But what if that farmer tells you that they actually felt humiliated during the application process? What if their traditional knowledge about what they know about elephant behavior was dismissed by officials? Those experiences are going to reveal procedural and recognitional injustices that those numbers on paper just can't capture. Okay. Qualitative coding allows us to identify these patterns systematically, right? We can analyze hundreds of interviews while preserving the rich detail that shows how justice actually functions. I've done this work, right? So my dissertation did exactly this. We had 40 in-depth interviews with farmers related to these five dimensions of environmental justice. And I unpacked through their experiences of human-elephant conflict how these different dimensions were surfacing in their lives to evaluate conservation impacts and outcomes, right? The example I'm going to give today is going to be marine conservation focused. I don't want to bury you in elephant information, but just know that I'm not speaking hypothetically here. I've actually done this work, okay? This is why coding is really essential in this type of research, right? We need methods that capture both the what and the how of justice experiences, okay? This is where the logic of framework analysis comes in, okay? Our approach uses something called framework analysis. This means that we're going to use theory to guide our process of qualitative data coding and analysis, okay? I think I said analysis four times in that passage. So we're going to start with predetermined categories in our case, right? This is called deductive coding, right? We already have the five dimensions of justice that are going to guide our research. We're going to use those as an analytical lens, right? There's other approaches. Inductive coding is where you're going to take, an interview or a policy document, and you're going to look for those categories and themes to emerge from the data. This is also rooted in grounded theory, but that's a discussion for another time, right? So it's a bit different when you have that starting point. Um, think of it like this: we're gonna put on five different pairs of glasses, and each one is gonna help us see different aspects of justice in our data. Okay, but the important part is that we're gonna use these dimensions as guides, but not rigid boxes. Okay. If our data reveals justice concerns that are not going to fit neatly into our five categories, and let me tell you, a lot of them are not going to, we need to be ready to expand our framework, okay? The theory serves our analysis, not the other way around, okay? Framework analysis has been tested across many different contexts, from toxic waste issues in the United States to mining conflicts in Latin America to conservation disputes in Africa. So it's a very well established way to get into the meat and potatoes, as they say, of qualitative data. This gives us confidence that our approach can work for analyzing human wildlife conflicts, marine based conflicts, and a whole wide array of other environmental justice issues. Okay. So now let's talk about operationalization. Let's talk about operationalization. There we go. This is a fancy word for a simple concept, right? It's defining observable indicators for abstract ideas. Each justice dimension becomes a family of codes that we can identify in our data. Let me give you an example with procedural justice. The philosophical concepts talk about fair processes. Remember this? But what does that actually look like in an interview transcript? This could be challenging to identify, right? We might observe mentions of consultation meetings or workshops or complaints about being excluded from decision making, or concerns about the timing of meetings or difficulty attending, or perhaps the speaker next to someone's house where village announcements are read aloud is broken. Each of these is a different procedural indicator, but they all connect to the broader concept of procedural justice or procedural fairness, right? So by developing this comprehensive coding scheme for each dimension, we can capture that nuance, right? That full complexity about how people are experiencing justice while keeping our analysis organized and systematic, which, as you'll see as we go through this, is incredibly important. So here's like an example of a coding hierarchy on the slides. So we have procedural justice, but we see themes of inclusion, transparency, appeal mechanisms, timing showing up, right? We're going to start grouping those into a family or a structure of codes. Okay? Everybody following me so far? I hope so. So in this example that I'm going to give in this lecture, I am going to do human elephant conflict. Sorry, I thought marine conservation is coming up, but in this example, it's human elephant conflict. So human elephant conflict, I just want to define for those who are unfamiliar, is a recurring negative interaction between people and elephants that results in crop and property damage, injuries, or deaths to humans and elephants, and social, economic, and conservation costs. This can be driven by overlapping space use, habitat loss, or fragmentation, resource competition, and this all takes place in coupled social ecological systems. Okay. So I'm going to take those theoretical dimensions of justice, right? And now I'm going to make them a little bit more tangible, a little bit more applied to what we're talking about with this specific case study. Okay. So let's start thinking about this example, right? Instead of just defining distributive justice again, let's see how it shows up in the data. Okay. So content observable indicators that we could start to see in the interview. Income loss mentions, mentions of compensation, mentions of markets, agricultural markets, local markets, market access barriers, right? Mentions of resource access, land, my land title, there's not enough water, my water is polluted by elephant dung, I'm not able to access forest products because I can't go into the national park, right? Risk distribution, who's bearing the costs of conservation or conflict, right? I can't sleep at night. I'm too scared. My kids can't go out and play in the yard at night. My kids, I'm worried about them walking home in the evening, right? Look at these sample codes, right? So we can see distribution. I skipped one. Benefits, tourism revenue, employment, infrastructure. Are people benefiting from elephants, right? These are all distributive, potential ways distributive justice can occur in these interviews, right? And then with the sample codes, we can start creating a logical framework to start evaluating these and organizing them, right? So every time we see somebody talk about loss, we could say dist loss, distributive loss, distributive comp, which is compensation, right? Distributive access, distributive risk. So when a farmer says in an interview, right, we lost half our harvest and no one paid us, that's clear distributive justice, right? We would code that as dist loss. If someone mentions getting new jobs from tourism, right, that could be or is clearly distributional benefit, right? Dist bin. So the point is that we're translating abstract ideas into clear systematic categories that we can use in our analysis, right? When you're doing qualitative data analysis, you always want to be keeping a paper trail, okay? Marking down everything you're doing in the most systematic way, because I can tell you from experience, you don't want to read these interviews 200 times, okay? Just keep that in mind. Procedural justice, becomes visible when people describe how decisions were made. Okay, I'll take a quick drink. Key indicators of this can include inclusion or exclusion from meetings. Right, that's typically the most classic example we're looking for. But also transparency of decisions, whether people feel they have a real voice, or are the actual forums where they're meeting? Is there anything actually taking place afterwards? Right. So you can code these around, proc include for inclusion, proc exclude, right? You're getting the picture. If someone says we weren't invited to the planning meeting, that could be proc exclude, right? If they say, well, we had a seat at the table, but our concerns were never really heard, there was no follow through, right? That could be proc include, right? But here's where it can get interesting and complicated, right? Sometimes people are included, but still feel excluded, right? So how are you going to code that, right? this this is where the iterative kind of coming out of those boxes really comes into play, like I mentioned, right? We have this framework, but we're seeing some interesting hidden dimensions and interplay mentioned. Okay, now procedural justice codes are going to help us track whether communities are seeing conservation or environmental decision making, like around a community forum to cite a hazardous waste facility, which we've talked about in like historical context. This will sort of show if the community views these decisions or forums as legitimate or just tokenistic consultation, right? These tokenistic consultations and illegitimacy can really undermine environmental work and community-based conservation. So this distinction is crucial for understanding how policies and programs succeed or fail. Okay. Now, recognitional justice in practice can be a little bit hard to find. It can be quite nuanced. And in some cases, people aren't necessarily as forthcoming to discuss it. And in some cases, it can be quite culturally specific, right? It's sometimes not as visible in different cultures, but it's going to be show up in how people feel their knowledge and identities are treated, like we discussed, right? So key indicators include, whose knowledge is valued, whose identities are respected, and evidence of cultural recognition or dismissal, right? So we might code, reco value. You can see that I've made a mistake on these slides. I have all the distributional codes down here at the bottom, but just trust me that these are just examples, okay? Reco value when traditional knowledge may be not respected. Reco ignore when it's dismissed. And you can see how we can create nuance around these, right? For instance, if a government official dismisses local ecological knowledge, right? So the expertise that's been developed by farmers over generations of living in this landscape and working the land as just superstition, we might code that as reco ignore, okay? But if a policy document integrates traditional farming calendars with scientific data, that could be reco value, right? So we see a positive recognitional point here. As researchers, we're looking to document these moments as systematically as possible. I'm going to mention this so much that it's probably all sound like a broken record, okay? Not just when they're obvious, okay? Recognitional justice often operates, as I mentioned, subtly. Our coding is going to help us reveal patterns that might otherwise be missed. The more systematic and diligent you are in your systematic process, the more likelihood you're going to catch these codes that may not be, black and white, okay? Structural justice in practice is going to look like, zooming out bigger systems and institutions, right? Indicators include, references to systemic barriers, land tenure issues, market structures, legal frameworks. It should be noted, and be careful, these sound pretty similar, right? Well, they're deeply connected, structural and procedural justice. In your coding and in your analysis, you need to be really clear about how you're going to distinguish this, okay? is this going to be specifically like examples of attending like local meetings? And is this going to be focused more on specific, let's say, policy, right? So for this, we could code struck land for land tenure, struck market for market barriers, struck legal for legal framework issues. When a farmer says, I can't get compensation because our land isn't titled, that's not just a procedural or distributional problem. It is as well, but it's also a deep reflection of structural barriers in the land tenure system. Are you also catching the trend that statements in an interview can be coded for multiple dimensions? Ooh, the plot thickens, gets more complex. By coding these patterns, we're connecting these individual experiences to systemic institutions, which is incredibly vital and often completely overlooked, okay? This is what makes structural coding different from just cataloging individual problems. This is really where justice informed research is showing in our approach, right? We're tying these injustice roots to causes in the social system, right? Okay. Ecological justice is going to be, again, a somewhat, growing new idea, complex dimension. It's really complex. It's going to appear when people talk about nature itself deserving care and protection. This also varies a lot culturally, okay? So indicators, include mentions of specific rights, ecosystem integrity, conflicts between humans and non-human needs. We might code, eco rights when people discuss animal welfare, or eco integrity when they talk about ecosystem health. For example, we could talk about, it's not the elephant's fault. They're just looking for food because of climate change or because of deforestation. They're lacking a lot of that forest cover and that vegetation that they used to eat in the past, right? This is a pretty clear example of ecological justice that we should unpack, right? This is also a great reference of traditional ecological knowledge showing up in our interview. So some participants may frame this as, needing like a mitigation or a conservation intervention. Others might talk about just like the intrinsic value of a river's health. Okay. So coding ecological justice is going to ensure that our analysis is not just stopping at a human-centered approach, right? It's not only anthropocentric, because there are also many cultures, indigenous communities that do not only think about nature and humans as separate, right? So we should think about this and we should adapt and we should understand the context we're working in, but ecological justice is an important dimension that shouldn't be overlooked. I do want to note that there's an error on these slides that it's all content observable indicators for distributional justice. I apologize for that. I can add these additional codes in an update, or you can send me an email if you'd like to have them in front of you rather than just listen to me talk. Okay, onward. So multidimensional coding, let me show you, how all five of these dimensions are going to work together in a real example. Okay, so let's go back to like a nice visual here. Let's go to like this one, nice elephant visual. So let's talk about elephant crop rating, right? So distributionally, farmers experience crop losses. That'll probably be in the interview, like the most visible theme or topic that'll come up, depending on how you're proposing the interview, right? But that would be distributional loss. Procedurally, they mentioned there was no consultation about a fence placement project. So we see procedural exclusion, right? Recognitionally, they mentioned that their knowledge about the elephant behavior was completely ignored and they knew that the fence wasn't going to work. Recognitional ignore. Structurally, they say that the land tenure issues they're facing is preventing them from getting any sort of compensation, and they don't want the fence to be put on their land. They already have limited resources. Struck land. And they mentioned that, elephants have already lost a lot of habitat due to deforestation, and, they have a right to get food as well. Ecological justice, right? So here you see how a single event or like a single description contains all five justice dimensions. And some of those statements that I went over could be coded for multiple dimensions, right? So by breaking it down this way, like right now it might seem a bit complex, but we're showing like a cascade and a network and like a systems map, okay? And it makes this, I promise in the end, it makes this more clear rather than more complex when you do your analysis, all right? So, like we mentioned, like what I can say from like a key finding of my research, I found that exclusion from decisions leads to more ineffective policies, which ignore local knowledge, which then is going to reinforce systematic exclusions, which is then going to fail to meet distributional needs and then create more ecological injustices for elephants, right? Do you see how this is all connected? This is why multiple dimensional analysis is so powerful. If we only looked at distributional harms, you wouldn't see all the rest of that, right? We might develop some sort of distributional scheme but it may be inaccessible to farmers, or it may not actually address the root cause of the conflict. Okay. So, where are we at now? We are at the integration analysis. So, this is just talking about, like, let's move on to critical methodology. So, before we move to like more applied application, let me be honest about our approach strengths and weaknesses. Okay. So, the strengths include systematic comparison, which is really good across cases, right? But and theory grounded analysis and capturing complexity while staying organized, right? This framework approach has been tested in many different contexts, which gives us confidence in its usefulness, okay? But there are limitations, okay? Our framework might not fit all contexts perfectly. We require a lot of interpretive judgment and coding decisions, okay? We're bringing bias to the table, which means different researchers might code the same thing differently, and there's always the risk of forcing data into predetermined categories instead of letting new patterns emerge, right? This is a weakness of qualitative data analysis. We can't sort of let the data do the talking in some instances because, in some ways, we're kind of giving it a voice, right? And we're kind of applying our own interpretation that is grounded in the lived experiences. So we have to be careful, right? So you have to have methodological humility, right? We use our framework as a starting point, right? And our framework in this example is the five dimensions of environmental justice, right? I'm showing you how this is practically applied. But it's not a rigid constraint, right? If our data consistently challenges our categories, we might need to return to the framework and edit that rather than ignoring that contradictory evidence. And I'm going to go through this in the corresponding lectures to talk about validation and checking and all this great stuff. So when we are bridging to applied analysis, let's summarize everything, right? So we've established that justice dimensions can be and are empirical categories, right? Not just philosophical concepts. I hope I've demonstrated how they are practical and real and tangible, right? And we position this framework analysis as a specific qualitative research approach. In the next lecture, we're going to get our hands dirty with the actual coding techniques. I'm going to walk you through how to actually accomplish this. I'm going to go over how you would do practical coding procedures, focusing on reliability issues, how to navigate software tools, but most importantly, we're going to work with real data to practice these five-dimensional framework applications, right? So again, to bring this full circle, right, we're talking about environmental justice. We're talking about the frameworks and the foundations of environmental justice, right? We're talking about different forms of justice theoretically. I'm showing you how these different themes and pathways of justice can manifest within environmental justice issues such as conservation programs, environmental hazards, etc. So now we're sort of walking through how you would take this and apply it in like a real world analysis scenario. Okay. So again, we start with concepts, we turn them into analytical tools, and we apply those tools systematically to understand a complex environmental justice problem. So I will be seeing you in the next lecture, and we will dive a little bit deeper. Thanks for your attention.